Anthony kept a notebook now, which seemed crazy even to him, but the notebook was the only thing that stayed constant. Tuesday's entry read, Emma, age 7, loves drawing. Prefers purple, calls me daddy, attachment parenting week 3. Thursday's entry, written the same handwriting but describing a stranger, Emma, age 7, climbs trees, scrapes knees, calls me dad, free-range parenting week 1. The support group met in the basement of St. Augustine's Church, where fluorescent lights hummed like trapped insects and folding chairs formed a circle of shared desperation. Anthony had started attending after the divorce, after Claire left, after the custody arrangement gave him Emma every other week. Single fathers supporting single fathers, the flyer had promised. What it delivered was something else entirely. You have to commit to a framework, Gerald always said. Gerald wore khakis and spoke with the certainty of a man who had found religion, except his religion was parenting methodology. Children need consistency. They need a paradigm. Each week, Gerald introduced a new approach. Each week, the other fathers nodded and took notes as if Gerald was handing down commandments from a mountain. And each week, Anthony went home and tried to implement whatever paradigm Gerald had prescribed, because nothing else had worked, and he was drowning in his own inadequacy. The attachment parenting phase had turned Emma clingy. She had followed him from room to room like a shadow, her small hand always seeking his, her voice a constant murmur of need. She had cried when he showered. She had slept in his bed, her breathing synchronized with his, her dreams seemingly woven into his own. "Daddy," she had whispered one night, "don't ever let me go." Then came free-range parenting, and Emma had transformed. She had stopped holding his hand. She had started leaving the house without telling him, returning with mud on her clothes and secrets in her eyes. She had called him dad, not daddy, and the shift in that single syllable had felt like a canyon opening between them. "Dad," she had said, voice flat and distant, "I don't need you to walk me to school." Anthony had written it all down, trying to track the changes, trying to convince himself that this was normal. Children grew. Children changed. But the notebook revealed a pattern that made his hands shake when he read it. The changes were too complete, too fundamental. Authoritative parenting came next, and Emma became a different child again. She followed rules he did not remember establishing. She spoke with a formality that seemed imported from another family entirely. She set the table without being asked, completed her homework with mechanical precision, and when he told her he loved her, she replied, "I appreciate that, Father," as if reading from a script written in a language she barely understood. The other fathers in the group never seemed to notice. They shared their own stories of transformation, of breakthroughs, of children who had been wild becoming calm, children who had been withdrawn becoming social. They called it progress, they called it growth. Anthony called Gerald after the authoritative parenting session, his voice cracking. "My daughter keeps changing. That's the point," Gerald had said, his tone warm with approval. "You're finally molding her properly." Molding. The word had settled into Anthony's stomach like a stone. He started testing Emma, small things at first. He asked her about the drawing she had made during attachment parenting week, the purple crayon masterpiece she had given him with such pride. She stared at him blankly. "I don't draw, Father," she had said. He asked her about the treehouse she had discovered during free-range week, the one she had described in breathless detail. She had frowned. "I don't climb trees," she had said. That would be irresponsible. Anthony stopped sleeping. He watched Emma at night, studying her face in the dim glow of the hallway light, searching for something he recognized. Sometimes he thought he saw flickers, brief moments where different versions of her seemed to surface and submerge like fish in dark water. A smile that belonged to the clingy child. A posture that belonged to the independent one. A word choice that belonged to the formal one. Which one was real? The question became a scream inside his mind. He stopped going to the support group. Gerald called. his voice tight with concern that felt more like a threat. "You need to commit to a paradigm, Anthony. Without consistency, children become undefined." "Undefined?" Anthony looked at Emma across the dinner table. She was eating quietly, methodically, the way the authoritative parenting model demanded. But her eyes seemed hollow, as if she was looking through him rather than at him. "Emma," he said softly, desperately. "Who are you?" She tilted her head, and for a moment, something terrible flickered across her face. Multiple expressions overlapping, multiple children occupying the same small body, all of them looking at him with the same question reflected back. "Who do you want me to be, Father?" The notebook sat on the table between them, filled with contradictory truths, each entry describing a real child who had existed and then been erased. Anthony realized with creeping horror that he had not been raising his daughter. He had been writing her over and over again. And somewhere in the margins between paradigms, the original Emma had been lost entirely, or perhaps had never existed at all. Perhaps there had only ever been this, a variable child waiting for her father to decide which version of her deserved to be real. The phone rang. Gerald's name appeared on the screen. Anthony did not answer. He could not answer. Because answering meant choosing the next paradigm, and choosing the next paradigm meant erasing Emma again. His daughter watched him with eyes that belonged to no one and everyone, and he understood that the only escape was the one thing he could never do. He could never stop being her father. Sarah Winters had been a counselor for 8 years, though sometimes the number felt wrong in her mouth, like a word pronounced incorrectly in a language she should have mastered by now. The recovery center occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a hotel, and the rooms still carried the ghost architecture of temporary living. Transitory spaces for transitory people, Sarah often thought, though lately the thought arrived with a strange echo, as if someone else had placed it in her mind. Her current client was Michael, a 42-year-old accountant whose hands shook during their sessions. They were working through the 12 steps, that familiar ladder of surrender and redemption that Sarah had guided dozens of people up before. Michael sat across from her, reciting his 4th step inventory with mechanical precision. "I stole from my daughter's college fund," he said. "I lied to my wife about working late. I endangered my family by driving intoxicated." Sarah wrote it all down, her pen scratching against paper in rhythm with the radiator's hiss. Standard confessions. Standard sins. She had heard them all before, in variations so similar they sometimes blurred together like watercolors bleeding into one another. "Good," she said, using her counselor voice, warm and firm. "Acknowledging these harms is crucial to your recovery." But Michael's face shifted, confusion crossing it like a cloud passing over the sun. "What recovery?" "I've been sober for 3 years." The words hung in the air between them, wrong and jagged. Sarah checked her notes. They clearly stated Michael was 2 weeks into the program. 2 weeks clean. 2 weeks of white-knuckling through withdrawal. She had written it herself. She recognized her own handwriting. "Michael, you came to me because you relapsed," she said slowly, carefully, as if explaining something to a child. "No," Michael said, and his certainty was absolute. "I came to you because I'm your sponsor. You called me last night. You said you were struggling." The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk, feeling the wood grain press into her palms like braille, spelling out a message she could not read. "I don't have a sponsor," she said. "I'm the counselor." Michael stood, and the movement seemed to ripple reality around him. "Sarah, we're doing smart recovery this month. Remember, self-empowerment? You wanted to try a different approach after AA didn't work." The words triggered something, a memory surfacing like a body rising from deep water. She saw herself sitting in Michael's chair, her own hands shaking, her own voice confessing to crimes she could not quite remember committing. The memory felt as real as the desk beneath her fingers. "No," Sarah whispered. She looked down at her notes. The handwriting was changing as she watched, morphing from her careful print into someone else's scrawl. Michael's name disappeared. Her own name appeared in its place, along with a diagnosis she had never received but somehow recognized. Delusional disorder, grandiose type. Patient believes herself to be a counselor. Sarah's office began to shift around her. The diplomas on the wall flickered between her name and other names, other credentials, other paradigms of authority that might or might not belong to her. The bookshelf held texts on 12-step facilitation, then smart recovery manuals, then harm reduction protocols, each volume solid and real until she blinked and found different books in their places. She stumbled out of her office into the hallway. Other doors lined the corridor, each one leading to a therapy room, each one containing a version of herself she half remembered being. Through one door, she saw herself facilitating a 12-step meeting, speaking with the fervor of the newly converted. Through another, she saw herself in a harm reduction session, calmly explaining how to use substances more safely, embracing an approach that contradicted everything the 12-step version believed. Each version was real. Each version was her. The building's architecture seemed to breathe around her, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, rooms multiplying down hallways that stretched into impossible distances. This had been a hotel once, she remembered. A place where people stayed temporarily before moving on to somewhere else. But she had never moved on. Sarah found herself in the lobby where a receptionist sat behind a desk. The woman looked up with a smile that was kind and terrible in its familiarity. "Dr. Winters," the receptionist said, "your next client is here for intake." Sarah looked at the waiting area. A woman sat there, mid-30s, professional clothes, slightly disheveled, eyes carrying the exhausted weight of someone who had been fighting too long. The woman looked exactly like Sarah. "I'm not a doctor," Sarah said, though even as she spoke, she felt the words losing their truth, reality reshaping itself around her denial. The receptionist's smile never wavered. "Of course you are. You've been running this program for 8 years. 8 years. The number that always felt wrong." Sarah approached her doppelganger in the waiting area. The woman looked up at her with desperate hope, the expression of someone seeking salvation from an authority figure, someone seeking a paradigm to cling to. "Are you Sarah Winters?" the woman asked. "They said you could help me. They said you run the best recovery program in the state." "Which program?" Sarah heard herself ask, though she already knew the answer would not matter. "All of them," the woman said. "I've tried everything else." Understanding crashed over Sarah like a wave of ice water. This was the intake. This was how it began. She would counsel this woman, guide her through whichever recovery paradigm the building demanded this week, and the woman would transform, would become the counselor, would take Sarah's place while Sarah cycled back to being the patient, starting the process over with a new paradigm, a new framework, a new delusion of authority. The recovery program was not 12 steps or SMART or harm reduction. The recovery program was the building itself, an endless cycle of roles and realities, each paradigm creating a new version of sobriety and a new version of the addict. Counselor and client trading places like actors in a play that never ended, never found resolution, never allowed anyone to truly recover because recovery meant leaving. And leaving meant the program would have no one left to sustain it. Sarah looked at her own face, staring back at her with desperate hope, and realized the most horrifying truth of all. She could not remember what she had been addicted to, could not remember what substance or behavior had brought her here in the first place. She could only remember the programs, the paradigms, the frameworks of recovery that had become her only reality. "Come with me," Sarah said to herself, leading herself back to the office, back to the chair, back to the beginning of a cycle she now understood would never end. Behind them, the receptionist made a note in her ledger, and somewhere in the building, another intake was beginning. I started the podcast in my spare bedroom, surrounded by case files and coffee cups, thinking I could make a difference. Paradigm Shift was supposed to be about how new forensic techniques could crack old cases, DNA analysis, digital reconstruction, blood spatter pattern evolution. I had 20,000 downloads by episode 3 and a Patreon that almost covered my rent. That was before I understood what I was really doing. The first case was the Holloway murders, 1987. 3 victims found in their suburban home, positioned in ways that made no sense according to the crime scene photos. The original investigators had called it ritualistic, but could not identify any known ritual pattern. I spent weeks analyzing how paradigm shifts in forensic psychology might reframe the evidence. I recorded episode 7 on a Tuesday night, my voice steady and professional as I laid out my theory about the killer's spatial reasoning. The episode went live at midnight. At 12:03 a.m., I received an email with no sender address. The subject line read, "You completed the first arrangement." The body of the email contained a single image. It was a crime scene photo I had never seen before, not from the Holloway case, but similar in its strange geometry. 3 figures positioned exactly as I had described in my podcast, down to the angle of their limbs, the distance between their bodies. The timestamp on the photo was 1993. I told myself it was a hoax, someone messing with me, fabricating evidence to match my theories. But the photo had metadata I could not explain, authenticity markers that suggested it had come from official police archives I did not have access to. I chose a different case for episode 8, the Riverside Disappearances, 1979. 4 people who vanished from a shopping center within a 2-hour window, never found, no bodies, no leads. I theorized about how modern surveillance paradigms would have tracked their movements, created a timeline, revealed patterns invisible to investigators working with inferior technology. The episode released on schedule. At midnight, another email arrived. Another crime scene photo, this one from 2001. 4 victims positioned in a shopping center's parking garage, arranged in the exact pattern I had described for optimal surveillance camera avoidance. I stopped sleeping normally after that. The connections were impossible, causality flowing backward through time like water running uphill. My podcast episodes were not analyzing old murders. They were somehow creating new ones, or revealing murders that had occurred in response to my analysis, or participating in something that existed outside linear time entirely. The research consumed me. I pulled records from decades of unsolved cases and found them. Murders that matched podcast episodes from true crime shows that had aired years later. The patterns were there if you knew how to look. If you understood that investigation itself could be a form of ritual, that describing a crime scene in sufficient detail was indistinguishable from manifesting it. My apartment became a cathedral of evidence, walls papered with printouts and photographs connected by red string like neural pathways in a vast, incomprehensible brain. I was mapping something larger than individual cases now. I was mapping the structure beneath them. The occult paradigm that governed certain murders, the way physics governed falling objects. Episode 15 was about the Blackwood case, 1972. A family found in their lake house, positioned around a dining table, as if waiting for a meal that would never arrive. I described how modern psychological profiling would reconstruct the killer's mindset, how new paradigms in behavioral analysis could identify the symbolic meaning behind each element of the scene. The email arrived before I even finished uploading the episode. This time it contained coordinates and a date, tomorrow. I drove to the location at dawn, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, telling myself I was going to stop something, prevent something, break whatever cycle I had stumbled into. The coordinates led to a lake house 2 hours outside the city. The building was abandoned, windows dark like closed eyes, but the front door stood open an invitation or warning. Inside, the dining room was set for a meal. 5 places, 5 chairs. 4 of them were occupied. I recognized the faces from missing persons reports I had researched for future episodes. Cases I had not covered yet. Cases I had been planning to cover. They sat perfectly still, positioned with geometric precision, waiting. The 5th chair was empty. I understood then, with the clarity of ice water in my veins, that I had never been investigating these murders. I had been scripting them. Each episode was an instruction manual, a ritual framework transmitted backward and forward through time, creating a pattern that existed independent of sequence or causality. The podcaster was not separate from the pattern. The podcaster was the pattern's way of describing itself. My phone was in my hand, recording automatically. Some part of me was already narrating this moment, already framing it for an audience, already turning it into content. The words came without conscious thought, following a script written in a language older than forensic science, older than investigation itself. Episode 16, I heard myself say, my voice distant and strange, like something speaking through me rather than from me. The paradigm shift finale, I sat down in the empty chair. The others did not move, did not breathe, existing in a state between moments that my old paradigm would have called death, but which I now understood was something else entirely. They were waiting for the episode to complete, for the pattern to close, for the investigation to reach its inevitable conclusion. Above us, I heard footsteps. Someone was in the house. Someone had always been in the house, waiting in the space between cause and effect, between investigation and commission, between the podcaster and the subject. The footsteps descended the stairs with the rhythm of a metronome marking time in a reality where my episodes and these murders were the same event. Viewed from different angles, where describing a crime and committing it were identical acts separated only by the inadequate paradigm of linear causality. The door to the dining room opened. I could not look. If I looked, I would see the face of every killer I had ever profiled, every murderer whose psychology I had analyzed, every subject I had reduced to behavioral patterns and forensic evidence. I would see my own reflection in their eyes and understand that the paradigm shift was complete. My phone was still recording. Somewhere, the episode was uploading automatically, releasing into the world, binding the next podcaster to the pattern, preparing the next iteration. The footsteps stopped behind my chair. I felt hands on my shoulders, gentle and final, positioning me with the same geometric precision I had described in 15 episodes, completing an arrangement I had been building unknowingly from the very first recording. Good, a voice said, and it sounded like my voice, like all our voices. Now we can begin the next season. The pattern was perfect. The pattern was eternal. The pattern required only witnesses who thought they were investigators, podcasters who believed they were solving mysteries rather than perpetuating them. I had wanted to make a difference. I had wanted my work to matter. In the end, I succeeded beyond my most terrible imaginings.